Alright, hey guys, today we are going to be talking about how to refute the Albin Countergambit with white here. And for those of you who don't know, the Albin occurs after d4, d5, c4. And in this position, instead of the more kind of classic moves like e6 or c6 or d takes c4, black says no, we're going to play e5 and turn the game into absolute chaos. And this can be tricky for a lot of d4 players to face, one because they might just not know how to, what to play in these positions after takes d4. Or also, not to mention the fact that these positions tend to be very different in nature to a lot of the classical main lines, for example, you'd get after the QGD, which can make these positions from more of a, just the nature of the position sort of thing, very difficult to play for a lot of 1d4 players. And so today I want to cover both of those issues with some examples and also some theory. But anyways, let's get right into things. So essentially in this position, this is kind of where things all start, right? Also, I should note that black could play a move like c5, trying to defend the pawn more proactively like this, but in this sort of position I think white can just chip away at the d4 pawn like this, and we can get a very nice advantage with just very natural developing moves like this, and we're just a pawn up. So usually what black will do here is they'll play knight c6, defend the pawn like this, and black has a couple different strategies. Sometimes they'll throw the bishop out to b4 check, sometimes they'll do stuff like that. Very often they'll use a plan like knight g7, knight g6, pick up the pawn like this, and they might also try and put a bit of pressure on the knight on f3 by playing moves like bishop g4. So those are kind of the general things we have to be looking out for. And also I should mention, ideally, what white would love to do in this position is to play e3, but it's very important you understand why this does not work. So essentially, if black had to take this pawn here, white would have a very nice endgame, a pawn up after something like this, and we would have no issues. However, the problem is that after e3, bishop b4 check, a very strong move from black, after bishop d2, black can simply take here, and now after f takes e3, the material balances white as a pawn, but look at these double pawns, right? This is not very ideal from a strategic point of view, and in practice, black does very well from here. And if white decides to play in this position, instead of taking back for the pawn, say I want to take this, well, after this in-between move, e takes f2 check, king here, and this queen exchange, it's actually even white who might be down material now, so this of course is also something that we want to avoid. And this brings me around to my recommendation for this video, which is to play in this position a3. There are also some other moves like g3 I think is the main line, and there's also knight bd2, which is going to be very similar to what I'm recommending, but I just think a3 is a little bit more accurate. And basically, what is the point of a3? Well, one point is actually that now we're threatening to kind of play b4 and then b5 and just pick up the pawn like this. It's very rare that's going to happen so simply, but it is an idea to watch out for. And another key point is that we covered the b4 square, and if black say tried to play a move like a5 here, stopping our move with b4, this is a fairly common move here, but I don't think this is anything to be too concerned about, because after white plays e3 here, once again, if black takes here, that's no big deal. But since they can't play this bishop b4 check here, it turns out we just have a very nice position. Say if black tries playing bishop c5, I believe this is the most critical move, just trying to keep the tension here. And now say white takes here, which I believe they should. Now if black just say tried playing a move like knight takes d4, we're not going to play a move like this, because after something like either bishop takes d4 or queen takes d4, this e5 pawn is very vulnerable. So instead what we're going to do is play a move like bishop e3, increasing the pressure on d4. And after some moves like this, black can try attacking this pawn, but we can just hold everything very nicely together here. Knight c3, knight d5 is an idea, and white's just simply up a pawn. I don't think black can do a whole lot. Although black can also try a different move here after e takes d4, they could try bishop takes d4, which is a little bit tricky, kind of enticing us once again to take, but we should be careful to avoid this, because after all these exchanges, there's knight c2 ideas, knight b3 ideas, and white pretty much has lost all the games in practice from here, so definitely avoid this. What we can do, however, is just continue developing here, bishop e2, castles here, and I actually played a very nice blitz game, which I'll show you guys right now. So here's a game here. Once again, it starts with these moves, just kind of showing this to repeat it in the head, get yourself a little bit used to these positions. e3 here, once again very important with these moves inserted that this works. And now after bishop c5 takes, bishop takes d4, a very critical move, I play bishop e2, not once again playing knight takes d4. And it might look like in a bunch of these lines here that eventually now we've kind of developed a bit, and black is kind of just recapture this pawn very soon. So what do we do here? And this is an important question to ask, of course. And what I realized in this blitz game after a little bit of thinking is maybe I can play bishop g5 here. And in the game, my opponent immediately collapsed here. By the way, my idea is that if black takes this, for example, this is simply going to be losing, because after queen takes d8, they're just simply overloaded all over the place and then losing the piece like this. In the game, they didn't do much better. Actually, they played h6, and after this simply takes, after either of these captures, this bishop on d4 is simply going to be hanging, so I won the game very quickly. However, it is worth noting that this move bishop g5 leaves this pawn hanging, so what does black do here? Sorry, what does white do after bishop takes b2? And my whole point was after rook a2 actually here, this is incredibly tricky for black here, because once again, if they take like this, and then take at the end of all of this, I'm simply going to be up a piece. And essentially what the engine says is that black's only real chance of holding this is to go for this in-between move f6 here, but even a position like this I find very difficult to imagine can be too great for black, so I would not be too concerned about this. However, coming around, instead of once again this a5 move, which is kind of something that you'll face sometimes, a more critical move and one that it's very important to understand how to play against is this knight g7 move, because once again, as I mentioned earlier, right, knight g6 is a very typical idea, just trying to come around and attack this e5 pawn. So what does white do from here? And now a very natural move that a lot of you will be very tempted to play is b4, but there are some very precise reasons as to why I'm not going to recommend this. Instead, I'm going to suggest knight bd2, and if you want, I'm going to leave a timestamp if you can just skip right to that, if you just really want to get kind of the very lean version of like, here's what you do and you don't care about like what happens if you do this. But I thought it's worth showing and kind of understanding why b4 is not the move we want to be playing here. With that being said here, the problem is with b4 is that after knight g6, bishop b2, black essentially, long story short, has this move a5, which is very strong, but the majority of people will probably just simply take on e5 here, the point being that after knight takes e5, takes, and e3, and essentially you get this line here, where knight takes c4 happens, something like this. This is generally a very pleasant position for white here, where black kind of has difficulty developing. Turns out they can actually play bishop e7 and sacrifice his pawn because their rook gets active and can recapture on g2. But a lot of people will instead kind of not try that, by the way. Instead of taking here, what white should do is just simply play knight 3, focus on development here. And black kind of has difficulty castling because we're also attacking this pawn and all sorts of stuff like that. But once again, what a lot of people will try here is, instead in a position like this, they might try a move like after bishop d3, queen g5. But this doesn't really work here, and it's going to be very important very soon to understand why this is so. And essentially the point is that white can just simply castle here. And if black tries playing a move like bishop h3, this does not work at all, because something like f4 here, the queen can get pushed around, but it's actually funny noticing that this bishop is sort of trapped here. It's just we can't take it right now because of this pin here. So if we just sidestep with our king to h1, for example, now we're going to be winning the piece next, and this is the decisively winning position. And basically the point is, if black can't play a move like bishop h3 in this position, they're just a pawn down, we have very active pieces, and their queen is doing like who knows what. So that brings us back to this move here. In this position, instead of knight g takes e5, a5, and essentially we get a very similar position here, but now with these moves a5 and b5 inserted, and this actually makes a big difference, because after bishop takes d4, e3 basically leads to the same thing. After bishop e6, we get this sort of position once again. And after bishop d3, this is going to lead to a very similar position we just saw. But now the problem is that queen g5 castles here is actually quite good for black. And the reason is, if you take a moment to really pause and think about why, is that our pawn's on b5, and black can simply take it. And all of a sudden, things are just going to get very messy. And sure, you might say, like, we don't have to castle here, we could play moves like f4, try kicking the queen around, like we did before, with moves like knight c3 here, for example. But after queen b3 here, it actually turns out that in this sort of position, right, like, think about it, material is equal here, and if we allow a queen exchange, this is actually going to lead to an endgame where our pawn structure is kind of just all over the place, whereas black's is fairly neat by comparison, and for this reason, I'm not a huge fan of white's position. Which once again brings us full circle to the whole point that in this position, all the way back here, right, that instead of going for this whole b4 idea in this position, I instead recommend knight bd2. And the whole idea is that now after knight g6, knight b3, this pawn is very difficult to defend, and what more or less will always happen is black will take with one of the knights on e5, we get something like this, a queen exchange now, and black wins the pawn on c4, and they're technically equal material, yes, that is true here, but it's also worth noting that after this move e4, white can gain a tempo on this knight here and gain a very nice initiative. And after the most logical or popular move here, knight d6, white has a nice sequence of moves which is worth remembering. So we can play e5 first of all, knight f5. Instead of playing a move like knight takes f5, which would help black develop their pieces and they'd be perfectly fine here, what we do is we continue to keep the initiative and pressure on black here with a move knight b5. And after this, king d8 or king d7 are pretty much young moves. King d8 seems a little bit more sensible though. White can play bishop g5 check, bishop e7, and you could castle long, but I don't suggest this because there are going to be some lines where we actually want to ignore black's threat here on the bishop on g5, which we can't really do with our kings on c1, because then at any moment here, for example, after bishop d3, bishop d7, bishop d3 is a move we'd love to play here, but bishop takes g5 simply comes with check here, so that doesn't work. Whereas after rook d1 check here, bishop d7, now bishop d3, bishop takes g5, runs into bishop takes f5, and now that we're simply going to be picking up a piece here, all because our king is still on e1 and didn't get into check. Which is why in this position here, after bishop d3, a very clever move by the way, and if black takes this way, I think we can just play bishop takes b5 check, and after something like this, this position looks quite good for white here, although we need to be a little bit careful because after takes is this. Maybe this is still good after something like rook d7, but we could also play a move like, in this position, bishop f4, keeping the bishop here on the board here, and with the king in the corner, the rook boxing like this, it doesn't feel like this can be particularly great for black. And so quickly, I'd just like to show a blitz game that I played in this variation a couple years ago here. So once again, we have all these moves, a3 here, knight g7, remember this is a variation we just looked at, knight g6, and all these sequence of moves. When in this position we gain all these tempi with e5, knight b5, king d8, this all happened in a blitz game, rook d1 check, bishop d3, g6 here, very important move covering this knight here, and now after bishop takes f5, g takes f5, and in this position I actually didn't play the best move. I played bishop takes e7 check, naturally sort of grabbing a pawn like this, but the problem is that after rook a8 here, which my opponent did not play, after something like castles, you have to be very careful because now bishop c6, and all of a sudden this knight is stranded here on the c7 square with no clear way out. And you might say, okay, we can play a move like knight d5 check, but after king e6, right, this e5 pawn's under a bit of pressure, bishop c6 still coming, putting pressure on this diagonal, so I wouldn't really say this is at all clear for white. And for that very reason, it was instead better to play bishop f4, keeping these e6 ideas in the bag here, targeting the c7 pawn like this, and this would be a pretty big advantage for white with these doubled f pawns. Once again, we can simply castle, double rooks on the d file, and this is very nice for white. And so the rest of the game, I could show some stuff like this happened, end up winning, but once again, black kind of counterplay against this, and got very messy, and we could have all avoided that in this position with bishop f4. Now for the main line that I'd like to cover in this video, it is bishop g4, and now knight g7 is also a very, once again, important move which we just covered, but this appears to be the main move by far in the Lee chess database. And the essential idea is, of course, is that if white just does nothing like play h3, then black will probably just win a pawn back like this and have a very nice position. So instead what white should do here is, instead of playing a move like h3, what we should instead do is play knight bd2, protecting the knight like this, so if black ever takes, we just keep our pawn structure intact very nicely, or to protect the e5 pawn, and this is no worries. But okay, this is an important position here after knight bd2. Black really has an abundance of options to go for, and the main ones I'm going to look at are queen e7 and knight g7. And first of all, why am I not looking at a move like queen d7? This does look somewhat natural, but the reason I'm not going to cover it so much is just after b4, I believe white has a very nice position here. Bishop b2, b5, and capturing the d4 pawn is a very primitive threat we have, and it's not so easy for black to counter. Whereas when black plays queen e7, the big difference is like, okay, black is preparing long castling in this variation, but the key difference is that black is actually attacking the e5 pawn in this variation, which makes this a lot more critical in my opinion. And so I'll show some further moves to how I believe you should play this position. So first of all, h3, just kicking this bishop away, and if black simply takes this here, like move like bishop takes f3, knight takes f3, I believe this is perfectly fine for us. For example, they took the pawn e5, something like this definitely is not something you should be scared of. Sure, we have double pawns, we can just simply continue playing development. Maybe we could even play like bishop g2, e3, short castles like this. It seems very solid, and eventually we can expand the queen side like that. However, what might be slightly more critical is a move like in this position long castles, when after something like bishop g5, I sort of like this, sort of throwing a wrench into black's plans of ever winning this pawn here. f6 is forced, and after something like takes, bishop h4, we can complete development with moves like g4, bishop g2, short castles, queen d3, and I think we have a very nice position. So usually what black will do is whenever h3 appears on the board, they will most likely play bishop h5, although once again there is that possibility they could take on f3. Bishop h5 is what I usually see though, And again, just playing g4, kicking the bishop away, bishop g2, just really focusing on quick development. And after long castles here, one move that I typically like to throw in such a position is to play queen a4. Essentially, we'll just kind of gain the queen very active around black's king, making black question their existence a little bit like that. And if they have a take on e5, it's worth noting that we should just be able to take, and after queen takes a7, this is just not something that you want your king to be in danger of, so I would be very happy if I ever got this. But usually people won't kind of play into white's hand so easily like that. They'll usually play king b8, protecting this pawn, and now this is sort of a threat. But don't go too crazy trying to hold onto that pawn anyway, not that I think you can at this point. Just play b4 here, and after some exchanges like this, knight f3, we can simply just castle here and let this e2 pawn hang. That doesn't even matter. If black takes it, note how they're also quite behind development. None of these pieces are developed, so what we can simply do is say like, okay, black, you can grab all the pawns you want, but after rook e8 here, you're looking like you're in a lot of trouble, and might even be close to resigning time for black here, so I would be happy if I got this. And the problem is that if black doesn't take this e2 pawn, we actually just have this very simple plan of playing bishop b2 and rounding up this pawn here, and it's to the point where the engine says like, okay, black, you have to play a move like c5. And the point being that, like, okay, if we have a take here, you can try and defend the pawn like this. But even so, this pawn is very loose in a lot of variations, and I don't really trust this for black. The whole point, though, is that, you know, if black has to play a move like c5, though, like, that is incredibly risky, opening this file for the rook if we ever take here, and leaving the black king very vulnerable. So, like, this sort of position, definitely nothing to be scared of. I like it a lot. You may kind of fumble around a few times in a couple practice games, so that's all part of the process. Eventually, you'll kind of get used to these positions and hopefully rack up some nice wins. However, once again, coming back to this position, it is worth noting that queen e7 and queen d7 weren't the only moves. There was also knight g7, but personally, I wasn't a big fan of this whole approach of mixing bishop g4, knight g6. It just feels a bit slow to me, and I'm going to show you why very quickly. So h3, just kick the bishop around, and in this sort of position, bishop h5 doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because if you ever play with like knight g6 now, your bishop and knight are simply going to be both fine for that same square. Not to mention, like, if you play knight g6 now, g4 trap the bishop, so that's obviously no good. Which is why usually if black does this, they're going to take on f3, then play knight g6. But in this position, what I simply like for white is to play this move e3, and this is a very common theme sometimes in the Albin Countergambit. Sometimes you can just go into a position like this, go into an endgame, you let black win their pawn back, but once again, we saw a similar variation earlier. White has a bishop pair. I think in that variation we didn't actually have the bishop pair. It was the whole knight b5 thing though. We were quite active. In this variation we do have the bishop pair though, because they gave it up on f3 early on. And just after a move like bishop e2, this position is very unpleasant to play for black, and I'll actually just quickly show a blitz game that I played from this variation a couple years ago. So once again, going through the basic opening moves here. In this game I actually played knight bd2 first instead of a3, but it transposed very quickly to this sort of position here. I play a3, stopping bishop b4 check actually. And after takes 6, bishop e2, bishop e7, we get this position where black now kind of plays a bit of a strange move, b6. Because now after f4 here, black kind of has to go to this knight d7 move, which looks a little bit awkward because it might look like you're getting some pins here, but apparently this is best. Maybe you play something like bishop d6, I think. But black didn't do that in the game, they instead played knight g6, a fatal mistake. And essentially what we're going to see here is the two bishops really just coming into play here very actively, and after this move here, my opponent immediately blundered with knight e7, simply hanging the bishop here. Maybe they mouse it, maybe they meant to play this, but even so, after a move like rook d7, our pieces are just so active that there's no way black can really hold this after bishop d6, for example, c5. If you ever take here, now the knight doesn't protect this anymore, so we can simply win the rook like this, and it's all curtains. So that just about wraps up like all the main theory you need to know. But just quickly rounding up some corners here, there are some other moves that we should quickly cover. Bishop e6, black could maybe develop the bishop like this, protecting the pawn, attacking the pawn in c4, but we can just simply play knight bd2 here, and it's like some other variations, right? If black plays queen d7, and this time they're not even really putting pressure on e5 with moves like bishop g4, so we just play b4, and I think we have a good position. Additionally, black would also play a gambit move like f6. I think I've faced this maybe like once in my life before. It's a possibility. What I'd suggest is simply take here, play knight takes f6, e3, and once again, if they have a take like this, we go into an endgame where just a pawn up, bishop g4, bishop e2, like maybe they could play bishop c5. I don't know, this sort of thing. It's very difficult to imagine that white would be disappointed. So yeah, that's everything for this video. I hope you guys are now armed to beat the Albin Countergambit and any players that continue to frustrate you with its opening. To be honest, it's one of these openings which I feel like once you learn, so you get the basic gist of things, you have a good kind of idea of what to do, and you never really have to learn it again. So if you learn it once, well, that should be pretty much all you need for pretty much the foreseeable future. But yeah, anyways, I hope you guys found this useful. You can win some nice games with it. Like the video, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you guys until next time.